Apologies for the length, but this one needs context. 10 years ago, my mother died, leaving a reasonably sized estate, mid-six figures US. For most of my life, I have been a misfit and a malcontent, with frequent run-ins with the law and one stay in a residential substance abuse facility. The cost of these things was generally paid by a family trust. My mom, now 10 years dead, would sometimes get drunk and say that she was keeping records and that my debts would be included in the will. My mother was also the only person in the family that I had come out to as a trans woman prior to her death. She was lukewarm supportive, refusing to help me afford a wardrobe or even help me pick one out, cosmetics or teach me to use them, HRT, or any surgeries. For that reason, I spent most of my 30s waiting for her increasingly fragile health to finish her off. And before you judge me for that, keep in mind I was born in the early 1970s and first started telling her that I was a girl when I was 3 years old. The therapy that middle-class trans girls got back then was barbaric, both for us and for our mothers, who were tasked with punishing gender nonconformity in us. Mom also said that she'd denounce me as a liar and disown me altogether if I talked honestly about my childhood, which included her burning me with lit cigarettes, telling me she'd wished she'd aborted me, and kicking me out of the house, all before my 10th birthday. Also bear in mind that insurance would not cover HRT or surgeries at the time I'd came out to my mom in 2002. The only way I was going to pay for my transition was prostitution or from my family trust. Shortly before she died, the laws regarding trans healthcare coverage changed, but by then, I was an insane mess, a walking ball of major depressive disorder and severe anxiety, unable to function in society at all. Knowing you're trans and not transitioning is torture. On the day she died in 2014, my brother flew into town, and I picked him up at the airport, and we drove over to my mother's luxury condominium. I sat in her living room, dumbstruck by the emotional release of it all, just wanting to absorb what little bit of her presence. I loved her, in spite of her abuse and gaslighting. I could. My brother immediately went looking for the will, and found it straight away. I sat there, sure I was about to be told I'd been written out of the will altogether, in spite of the fact I'd been the child who showed up a couple times a week to cook her a decent meal and accompanied her to medical appointments to ensure she was asking all the pertinent questions and getting appropriate treatments. I was sure she'd want to deny me an easy transition. When my brother started demanding to know where the real will was, I understood that I had not been excluded. The will she'd left evenly distributed her assets to him and me, naming him executor. I realized at that moment I would be able to transition on my own terms. I immediately began looking for the book I'd lent her about transgender people, The Flawed True Selves, which I suspected still had my coming out letter in the cover. As my brother searched for the real will, I was going through Mom's books. He abruptly asked me what I was looking for, and I described the book in generic terms, and he replied, "Oh, True Selves? I have it." That's how I found out that my mother had outed me to my brother, the person I was depending on as emotional support during transition and during surgical recoveries. The one thing I'd asked my mom to do was to let me come out to the family on my terms, and that's how I found out she'd betrayed me. I was dumbstruck, in absolute shock. And the only thing my brother could talk about was the money I've owed to the estate. I don't know how long the browbeating went on, but eventually I told him I'll give you 3/4 of my share if you'll just SD a few about the money and let me grieve. He agreed to this, but never stopped badgering me about the money. Because he was the executor, to access the money for himself, he needed to give just as much to me every time he took a withdrawal. Every time, he would remind me to set 3/4 of it aside for him, and for a good long while, I did. I had over $150,000 of certificate of deposit accounts just for him, expecting him to demand them back at any time. But over time, I became aware of the abuse inherent in the agreement. Not only had he never lived up to his end of the deal, he abjectly refused to discuss my gender identity every time we met in person. So my anxiety and depression got worse, even with $200,000 in the bank. I did not feel stable enough to begin social transition, so I did not seek out HRT. This was a tragic error in hindsight, and I was not even stable enough to work. One day, almost a year after Mom died, He came to me with a demand I wire $47,000 to a dealership for a brand new car he'd purchased. I went to the bank to do it, and only the fact he didn't have the requisite banking info kept me from doing it. This was on a Friday. I left the bank in a severe anxiety attack. I spent the weekend praying and meditating. Then, on Monday morning, I contacted a lawyer who, after I'd paid a modest retainer, told me I should refuse the request and direct any future requests for money to him. When I told my brother this, his text response was, "I guess you know this means you're uninvited to my wedding." That's the last thing he has ever said to me, to this day, 9 years later. So, AITA for reneging on a deal costing my brother more than $150,000?